Well, folks, hello again. This is Dr. Jay Smith here in my office, and you'll see another hairy face up there right along with me. That is a brand new friend, and I just got to know him. Some of you may already know who he is. This is Odon Lafontaine. He is from France. We're about 3,000 miles apart, and yet isn't this great? The technology we have where we can talk to each other, we can discuss with each other, and it's as if we're right in the same room. Odon, good to meet you.
Good to meet you, Jay. Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me. And hello, everyone. Odon Lafontaine speaking, though.
Well, Odon is a unique individual. He says that he's a younger version of me, and you'll see why. Because he's doing much the same thing I'm doing. They're all in French, so he is speaking in English. This is his second language, and I haven't met many French people who speak as well as he does. Now, why we brought him on board? Well, you have been watching and you have been seeing that we have gone through a number of people who have tried to find how Islam really began. We've said, and I think pretty much destroyed the idea that Islam, from what the traditions tell us, from the 9th and 10th century traditions, we have pretty well destroyed that notion that any of that makes sense for the 7th century. For the 9th and 10th century, redacted back to the 7th century, we can understand why Muslims are saying what they're saying. But today, not many of us, those of us who are on this channel or who are listening to the many different videos we've been putting up, would agree that the Abbasid, the standard Islamic narrative, is accurate. And so we have shut that down by looking at rock inscriptions, by looking at coins, by looking at manuscripts, by looking at artifacts, by looking even at buildings and mosques and qiblas from the 7th century. And we see what is being told us, what we have all heard, just makes no sense in the 7th century. Now, we have persuaded you, and we're convinced. The problem is, okay, so now we know the problem. How do you solve it? Well, to solve that, we need to go back to the 7th century and try to look at what is there, see what's on the ground. Let's look at those artifacts. Let's look at those coins. Let's look at those manuscripts. Let's look at and see what exists, because there's lots of material in the 7th century that nobody has been paying attention to. Well, I should say not nobody. There have been a few. And one of them is Odon. Odon, who has come on board. He has been doing this for quite a few years. And I just want to, he will probably introduce himself, but he has been working with another French priest whose name is Edouard Marie Galez. I know I've desecrated the name, and Odon will probably correct me on
priest
that.
From Belgium.
He is Belgian, but he is French speaking. And his book called The Messiah and His Prophet, has that been translated into English?
Not yet.
Not yet. Maybe we'll have Odon do that, or maybe Edouard Marie do that. But he does have a English-speaking website which you can go up to, and it's called rootsofislamthroughhistory.com. I'll put it right here at the bottom. You'll see it there. Rootsofislamthroughhistory.com. You'll see it. Go ahead and look at the articles that he has put up. Those are for us who are English speakers. You can go ahead and see him. Now, Odon himself has written his own book. He has been a kind of disciple of Edouard Marie and has created his own thesis that he's been working on for years and years. I'll let him explain it. And it's called The Great Secret of Islam. The Great Secret of Islam. That is in English. Am I correct on that?
At first, I did it in French. And I'm working on the English translation. I think it will be available within the end of the summer.
Okay, so by this summer, he has promised, from his lips to your ears, he has promised that will be available in English for those of us. Now, Odon, so good to have you. I have gone through this material. I have already had Mel, who is a good friend of yours from Sneakers Corner. I have had Murad. I don't know if you know him, but he is from the Middle East. I've also had Joe, who is you probably have been seeing his videos up in the last few weeks, where he has come with his thesis, is much more from a Sadducee Jewish environment. And then I've also had Paul from London, most recently, and now we're coming to you. So we're kind of going right down through all the major players, and there are about 5 of you guys. I know there's another girl that's coming out of Australia. I'd like to get her on board and see what her view is. But what I want to do with you, Odon, and I kind of have you at the end, because I think you have been in this longer than anybody else. I think what you're coming up with is probably better than what the others have come up with. Nonetheless, I want people who have been on my channel, they have heard what Joe said, they have heard what Mel has said, and Murad, they have heard also what Paul has said with his, what he calls the Jerusalem thesis. And they have been trying to do what the Muslims should have been doing. This is what Islam should have been doing for years. And that is, how did Islam really begin? They don't want to touch this subject. So we're having to do it for them in some ways. We're having to fill in the gap. And this is the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about. If all these problems exist, Odon, which they do, looking at the traditions, we've got the wrong man at the wrong place, doing the wrong thing at the wrong time, that we know the problem. How do you solve the solution? Well, that's why people like you, we need people like you to come on and help us try to make sense of what was going on in the 7th century. Now, this is my first time to get to know you. I've seen some of your videos. I do speak a bit of French. And so though I've even watched some of your French videos. By the way, your French is beautiful and it's great to listen to you in French. So what I want you to do, Odon, is get us going. Help us. You're not going to do everything today. We're just going to have an introductory talk, kind of give us an overview. But before you do that, why even are you in this? What is your interest? Why did you come onto this particular subject, and what have you found? Over to you.
So, why am I interested in Islam? It's because I am curious. I had a Muslim colleague. We had lots of discussion about Islam, hence about the Quran. I've read it, and what I found in the Quran did not fit, I think, what my Muslim colleague told me. I did not find in the Quran the kind of correction of the Gospels, of the Bible, that he told me the Quran is about. I found something else. I found a kind of going back into orthopraxy. It's as if Jesus had taught us nothing. And this was very, very odd. And I thought to myself, there is something wrong with this narrative. And it has to be, there is something in Islam's origin that we have to, that is not clear. And I started to read books about it, to attend to conferences, to meet scholars. And so I met Edouard Marie Galès, who you presented. Edouard Marie Galès published a very big thesis in 2005 in France, The Messiah and His Prophet, a very huge thesis. It was an attempt to synthesize, to make a kind of, to get a global view on Islam's beginnings, Islam's origin, starting from the Jewish expectations of a political Messiah, spanning through centuries up to the 7th century and thereafter. It was a huge thesis. It had some major discoveries in it, but it was so huge that those discoveries were kind of hidden by the rest. And one of them is a sort of new Quranic study, which he made with the help of major Arabic scholars, such as Antoine Moussali, and there was also a tradition among Arabic-speaking Christians, Eastern Christians, a tradition of Quranic studies before Antoine Moussali. And he was one of the first to study the Quran as a source, as an historical source. And when you do so, you found lots of stuff in this text, lots of new stuff, things that haven't been studied yet. For example, that the believers that are described in the Quranic text are being taught by a small Jewish group. Edouard Marie-Gallès identified them as being the Quranic Nazarenes. And this is this small group that taught them to try to conquer Jerusalem, rebuild the temple there, have Jesus come back, and trigger the apocalypse. And this is the main theme of the Quran. And Jay, I think you will you will get my point. You might remember Patricia Crone and Michael Cook's first publication, their thesis, Hagarism, which was published at the end of the 70s, 79, something like this. And in Hagarism, it was also a groundbreaking publication. They look into non-Muslim testimonies, non-Muslim sources, and they form hypotheses with those non-Muslim theses, and they were asking whether Islam came from a small Jewish group leading Arabs into conquering Jerusalem. But at the time, as Patricia Crone told it thereafter, they did not have enough material to really found this hypothesis.
Hagarism came out in 1977, and when she came out with her Hegelian thesis, it was mocked by many people. It's still mocked today. But the material when I read Hagarism, I had to read it back in the 1990s and under Gerald Hotting. And I remember much of her book has, in fact, almost, if you read Hagarism, half of each page is footnotes.
Exactly.
Sometimes there's only 2 or 3 lines, and then the rest is footnotes. And it's the footnotes that make that book so powerful, because she has so much material. But she was ahead of her time. She didn't know what you now know, what we know, because that was back in 1977, long time ago. That was reason. And her other book that came out after that, Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, 1987. So 10 years later, when she wrote Meccan Trade, she was much more, she knew an awful lot more. And that book probably is a standalone book as well.
Yes, it is a standalone book. It has, it's different from Hagarism. What I try to say there is that at the time of Hagarism, Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, they formed a grand hypothesis about Islam's origin, but as they told, they did not have enough material, even though they had tons of footnotes and so on, because it only relied on non-Muslim sources, and it was not enough. But now, especially with Gallès' work, we have new material, a new source, the Quran itself, which confirm the Hagarism scenario, or corrects it a bit. And this is really, really interesting. And I think the general public, your audience, doesn't know about those new Quranic studies.
Okay, Odon, let me just, what I'm hearing you say, back in the 1970s, 1977, with Patricia Crone, when she came out with Hagarism along with Michael Cook, that was way ahead of its time. And it tried to look at Islam from outside of Islamic sources, much like what
Exactly.
our Robert Hoyland, this book here did, seeing Islam as others saw it. This is kind of a tome.
Islam as others saw it.
This is what all of us have been using. This is kind of our textbook for finding out what happened in the 7th century. And for those of you who know Mel or even Joe, we always are referring to this book. This is the one that we've always been referring to because it's so pivotal. But what you're saying is that can only go so far. You can only go so far with it because, again, it's outside of the Arab sources. You have to go back to the Quran, is what you're saying. If you go to the Quran, it unpacks for you a much better view of how Islam began, the origins of Islam. Is that
exactly? Exactly, Jay. It unpacks this view, and it also gives us the understanding of how Islam emerged, how the narrative changed. Because you see, the Quran is not. There are two ways of reading reading of the Quran. You can read it according to the standard Islamic narrative, or you can read it kind of literally for what it really is. And so you've got two readings of the Quran. The literary reading gives you intel about what really happens. And the standard Islamic narrative gives you intel about how Islam emerged. When you compare the one with another, you get the big picture.
Let me just
was not
this one. Hold on. What do you mean by reading the Quran through the standard Islamic narrative versus reading the Quran literalistically? Help me here. How are you distinguishing these?
For example,
what do you mean by reading those two different ways?
When you read the Quran through the standard Islamic narrative, you already have in mind a lot of Islamic concepts. For example, Islam. You're supposed to read the Quran as being the revelation of Islam, as a religion.
Let me just see if I'm understanding. This is for the hearers. When I open my Quran in English, almost any given page, here is the Quran in Arabic, here is the Quran in English, and then down here is the commentary that explains, or even as I am reading, there is parentheses. This is called commentary. And this commentary is what you're saying is the standard Islamic narrative. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. Okay. Exactly.
Okay. Well, that's what Muslims today want you to believe those verses mean, is what you're saying.
Exactly. And bear in mind also that even without reading this commentary, we already have in mind the standard Islamic narrative. We already think that Islam was uttered by a prophet, but it's not really in the Quran.
Okay.
Islam came in a unique place, like Mecca, but it's not in the Quran, and so on. There are many key expressions in the Quran that the standard Islamic narrative has kind of transformed. For example, the people of the book, al-Kitab, in the Quran, the standard Islamic narrative tells us they are Jews or Christians, or sometimes they can be Muslims according to the context. But when you really look into the Quran, when you abide by a global exegesis, you look at every occurrence of the people of the book in question, and then you realize that it's not about Jews or Christian or Muslim, but it's only about Jews. Only about Jews. The people of the book are the people of the sacred Jewish scriptures, mainly the Torah. And once you've established it, you realize also that the kuffar, for example, the kafirun, the unbelievers in the Quran, are not the unbelievers. This is the standard Islamic narrative. But if you read it literally, it's not about unbelievers, but about coverers, people who cover. And what do they cover? They cover the sacred scriptures, the sacred Jewish scriptures. And what exactly did they cover in those scriptures? The coming of the Messiah and the fact that Jesus was the Messiah, and so on. And you have like this many key expressions to kind of decode the standard Islamic narrative and understand hence what the literal text of the Quran is. And this text is not about Islam. It's very, very odd. People tend to think, and especially Muslim, that the Quran is the starting point of Islam. that Islam was founded on the Quran. Whereas, in fact, really, the Quran is a product of Islam. Islam came first, and then came the Quran as the divine revelation. So Islam is kind of, it's much more than the Quran. And the Quran is kind of an instrument formed by Islam to justify itself as being a divine revelation. And the fatal flaw of the Quran is that it has not been made with Islamic text, but with pre-Islamic text, with proto-Islamic text, text from before Islam, text which then had another meaning than the meaning of the standard Islamic narrative. And this is a kind of really a fatal flaw. And when you really look into the Quran, you see it for what it is, a pre-Islamic text, pre-Islamic preachings about something else than Islam.
Are you familiar with these two books? You have them right there.
The other one I have, it's here in the library. Yes, I'm familiar with it.
Okay, so you know Luling and you know Luxembourg. So you would agree with
Luxembourg. I've met him. We exchanged emails.
Okay, so you're in contact with him now.
Yeah, but he's a very, very old man. I don't know him very much. I've met him once, and I've exchanged some emails with him, but we have friends in common.
So you agree with this? You would agree with his thesis?
Not with all of it, as well as with Luling's thesis. They really uncovered something. There is an Aramaic background to the Quranic text. But it does not mean that the Quranic text was an Aramaic text. They did not prove that, in fact, really. They proved that the people that preached, the preachers in the Quran had an Aramaic way of thinking, an Aramaic way of speaking Arabic. This is what they really proved. They did not prove, apart from some particular verses, that the whole of the Quran was at first an Aramaic text.
All right, let me just throw this. Odon, let me just, before we move on to, let's just stay with this subject. And before we do that, let me just back you up on some of the things you've already said, just for the hearers, so that if I can follow what you're saying, I think the rest can follow what you're saying. And that is, I seem to hear what I'm hearing from you is that to understand the origins of Islam, we can go to the artifacts. They will take us so far. We can go to all the material like the coins, and we can go to, and certainly the inscriptions, we can go to the mosques, and we can go to even the documents written by people like Thomas the Presbyter and Sabaeus and all these others. But that will only take you so far. You need to actually look at the Quran, it's what you're saying, to be able to really understand how Islam began. However, you're saying the Quran that we have in our hand today, the Quran, we have to make sure that we read it correctly. Don't read the commentary. Throw the commentary out, because that just gets in the way. And don't come with a preconceived idea that the Quran is a revelation from a man named Muhammad between 610 and 632. Throw that away to begin with. That's what you're saying.
Exactly.
But there was a Quran. Are you saying there was a Quran? This book did exist in the 7th century. Are you saying that?
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
Not at all.
You're saying a proto-Quran. What is this proto-Quran that you're referring to?
No, it was about the Ur-Quran. I think there was no proto-Quran or Ur-Quran, as Luling wrote it. The Quran, as the book you have, is an Islamic concept. There was no book. There was no mushaf, if you understand the Arabic word.
Mushaf means book, codex.
A codex. You see, the Quranic studies, exactly, a codex.
So you're saying this did not exist in the 7th century?
Not at the beginning. There was no Quran.
Okay.
I think maybe the first books were written or copied after the 650s, maybe.
So
maybe
the second half of the 7th century, they started to
But
be
at
written.
first, what was it? There were some preaches from Arabic Arabic Nazarene preachers. They preach Arabs, and they wrote notes and drafts for the preachings. And this was the material, the first material with which the Quran was made. You see, in fact, the Quran is kind of, you see, it's a corpus, which means it's an assemblage.
Amalgamation of different texts.
An amalgamation of various texts. You see, the Quranic studies have made huge progress since Lulling and so on. If you look at what Guillaume D in Belgium is producing, it's amazing. He proves that the Quran is a corpus with layers and layers and layers of different texts with different origins. You have Bible commentaries, you have pseudo-historical narrative, you have there are many layers to the Quran. Someone like Guillaume D proved it. He proved that there are some Bible commentaries, that there are some historical narrative or pseudo-historical narrative, that you find homilies, Christian homilies, for example, from Jacques de Sarroug, James of Sarroug. You find many different texts, and you find preaches, instructions. The believers are listening to a predication, and preacher gives them instructions. This is one kind of preaching, and you find also instruction for the predication, instruction for further preaches. You see a sort of master preacher teaching a student preacher what he should tell the believers, the Arab audience, when one, for example, responds, when one tells him that it's only ancient tales that he's telling, and so on.
Okay,
and so you see, when you look at the Quran for what it really is, you see those different styles, you see those different kinds of, it's not a homogeneous text. And mostly, a large part of the Quran, I think, is a copy and recopy and re-recopy of those preaches and preaching instructions. And they were made on drafts or notes, which explains why the absence of diacriticism. You see, at the beginning of the 7th century, diacriticisms existed. Not the whole apparel of the diacriticism, but some of it existed. We see, for example, in the Egyptian papyri, diacritical marks.
Okay.
Why
just,
are
just
there
so people
no
know what you're saying,
diacritical?
you're talking about diacritical marks. That means the dots.
Exactly.
In
The
the
dots,
mouth.
exactly. We have very early Arabic papyri from Egyptia, I guess from the 640s, on
Egypt.
which we find those diacritical marks. Not all of them, but some, which mean they existed at this time. So why in the first Quranic fragments are there no diacritical marks? Gall's hypothesis is that it was made on purpose. It is because those fragments were copied from drafts and notes. And you see, when you take notes, you do it in a hurry. You you don't put all the marks and so on, and it's only for your own use. And so this is an explanation of the origin of the Quran. The Quran.
So what you're saying, Odon, is these are shorthand texts. When you have a secretary who is writing dictation from her boss or his boss, they write very quickly. They just do shorthand. In some ways,
exactly.
When you have a Arabic without diacritics, this is shorthand. So you're coming from a position which not many other Muslim scholars would agree with, that the earliest Arabic had diacritics. Not many scholars would agree with that. For instance, look at this one here. This one is not a shorthand. This is not note taking. This is very stylized. This is well written. You can tell it's been done by a scribe. It's on a codex. There's no diacritical marks there. So how would you explain that?
It's because it is not an early manuscript. It is a Kufi manuscript from at least the 8th century, I think, maybe even later.
749.
But I'm talking about the earliest manuscript.
Okay, let's give you one of
the. For example,
earliest.
The Sana manuscript. You've got them all.
Well, here's the Ma'il. The Ma'il, that's one of the earliest ones. That's the slanted script. That is even earlier than the Topkapi. You can see it has no diacritical marks, but this is not note-taken. This is very stylized. This is well written. This is a codex that is meant to be read.
This is already the work of scribes. So why do those learned scribes omitted the diacritical mark? You know François Desroches, I guess. He studied a very ancient manuscript, the Parisino Petropolitanus.
This is the Parisino Petropolitanus right here.
Exactly.
So this is
one of his conclusions.
Look at it. Also has no diacritical marks, no vowelization, no dama, no kasra, no fatha. But this is not a note taking. This is not by a secretary. This is very well written.
Exactly. What I'm telling you is those are not the originals. Those are copies and recopies and recopies of drafts and notes.
But
and
if you're copying, why would you not put the dots in? Then why would you not put the dots in once you recopy it?
Because they were not there at the beginning. François Desroches, when he studied this manuscript and others, he realized that the scribes did not know what they were copying. Because sometimes they put the diacritical marks in a way, then in another way, and it was kind of an anarchy of diacritical marks, which means that those scribes, even if they were very learned and even if they knew Arabic, they did not know what they were copying. They did not know the sense of it. Some Arabs may have known the sense of it, but not the scribes.
Okay, we're going into, and this is exciting, and we're going to have to do a video just on what you're coming up with here. But let's get back now. Odon, you've got such a great mind, and you've got so many different areas that you're acquainted with, and you're bringing up new ideas that we've not heard yet. This is the first time I'm hearing this, and it's exciting, and I think it's great because that may help us bring a whole nother paradigm of what exactly what's going on and why we're seeing what we're seeing. But let's go back, and we do need to bring this to a conclusion so that this is an introductory talk just to get you, so kind of introduce you to all the people on my channel, and also to come up with a whole nother thesis that is different than Joe's and Mel's and Paul's and the others. So let's...
No, it's not that different. You'll see Paul and Joe and Mel, especially Mel, we are working on the same material. Mel has read my work, he has read my book, and many of what I will tell you now has already been told by Paul and Joe or Mel. But the thing is to have a global view, a sort of scheme, a grand scheme of what happened, and not get lost into details. Details such as who was the real Muhammad, what exactly did he do, because this is not... we are not learning about Islam's origin this way. We have to, at first, to look into the big picture, what really happened during the 7th century. This is what the standard Islamic narrative does not. The standard Islamic narrative
Hold on,
does not.
let me ask some broad picture questions so that we can finalize this episode. Let me just throw them out here, and you come back with what you're saying. Now, would you agree, or do you even care whether there is a 7th century Muhammad?
No, this is not that important.
Okay.
I think there were several. In fact, there might have been several early Muhammads, and I think the caliphs, especially Abdul Malik, thought himself to be a Muhammad, which is why he wrote it on his coins. So,
okay, so you would agree with Murad. Murad is the one that first came out with that idea, and we kind of run with it, the rest of us, that when he was writing on the Dome of the Rock, those inscriptions there, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, he's referring to himself.
I think he's referring to Jesus and himself.
Okay.
And he's sort of making himself an equal of Jesus. Jesus was the God's apostle, God's envoy, and so is Abdul Malik. But this is not the response you wanted for. You asked me about Muhammad as being a prophet, I guess, not the caliph. And no, I don't think it's that relevant. It's not that important because Islam does not really come from a prophet or several prophets. It comes from a long process. And this is a big picture I'm trying to tell you about. It comes from a context, a religious context, an historical context, a geopolitical context. In the 7th century, for example, everybody thought that the apocalypse was imminent. Everybody thought that the Messiah will come. So the Jewish Messiah will come for the Jews, or Jesus will come back for the Christians.
My second question. Do you believe that everything we're looking at happens much further north, or does it all happen down in Mecca and Medina in Hijaz?
I think it happens among the Arabs.
And where are the Arabs?
The Arabs were scattered throughout the Middle East. There were the Ghassanids, which were at the east of Syria, the Lahmids in Mesopotamia, Kindi Arab in the central Arabia, the Nabateans. There were Arabs everywhere. There were nomads, but there were also they also settled. Some of them were Bedouins and roamed along the Silk Roads and the trade routes. But some of them had settled and were agricultures, peasants, fishermen, and it happens among the Arabs, along the trade routes. So in Syria, in Jerusalem, a bit in Arabia, in Mesopotamia. But we were talking about, you see the standard Islamic narrative, and also some early sources tells us that Muhammad was a merchant, which means he kept on going along those routes. He was not stuck in Mecca, for example, or in Medina. The early sources tells us about wars and fights that were fought in near Gaza, for example. They tells us about things happening in Mesopotamia or near Edessa. You see, we are stuck with a standard Islamic concept of the uniqueness of the place of origin. I don't think there was one place of origin. I don't think it happened north or it happened south. It happened everywhere because the preachings, you see, when a merchant, a nomad, travels the trade route, he takes his goods with him in order to make his trade, but he also takes his ideas. And we see a lot of turmoil in terms of idea in the Middle East. We see this also in the standard Islamic narrative. If you really look into it with a critical view, you see, for example, that there was the Muhammad movement in Mecca and in Medina, but there were also other prophets, which is very, very strange. How come the standard Islamic narrative is naming other people prophets? This is the theme of the false prophets. Of course, there are false prophets according to the Islamic narrative.
Odon, I'm going to rephrase that because you're not answering my question yet. You still haven't answered my question. I'm going to ask it again. I'll rephrase it. Do you believe any of this material that you have come across from the 7th and 8th century, the 7th century specifically, takes place in Mecca and Medina, or in Yathrib and Mecca?
No, I don't think so. Maybe in Medina, but it's a far-fetched hypothesis.
Do you believe any of the trade went through Mecca and Medina?
There was no trade route in Mecca.
Was there a Mecca?
Mecca is a no-go zone. No one wants to live in Mecca, even today. So I don't think anything happened in Mecca, really, during the 7th century. Maybe at the end of the 7th century, with the wars between the Zubayrids and the Umayyads, maybe something happened then. This is Gibson hypothesis. We could look into it, but before this, you do not found a city in such a barren place. There is nothing in Mecca, nothing. You cannot live there.
Okay, so most everything that you are looking at, when you're looking at, and I want to just ask you this name, these Arab Nazarene, you brought that up. These Arab Nazarene.
Arabic-speaking Nazarenes, yes.
Arabic-speaking Nazarenes, these people all lived where?
We find archaeological evidence of their living here. So here we have evidence, but we also find textual evidence that some of them were with the Arabs on their trade routes and their various settlements.
Well, okay.
So I think there was a kind
you're
of...
still not answering the question. Where? Trade routes, trade routes could be anywhere. Where did they live, and where did they come up with their ideas, and where did they come up with the Quran that you're saying that they wrote? Where was this?
No. They did not wrote the Quran. The one who wrote the Quran were the Arab leaders after the fall of Jerusalem. They wrote drafts. They wrote notes. This was not the Quran.
Okay.
This was something else. They were... You get my point?
These people, these Arabs who speak, or these Nazarenes who are Arabic speaking, where did they live? Help me here. You're saying they went on trade routes. Okay, that means they were traveling. Where did they live?
We have archaeological and very strong evidence that some of them lived in Syria.
Okay, Syria. Where else?
And keep in mind that in Syria, we also find archaeological evidence of the Quraysh tribe.
Quraysh tribe in Syria as well. Okay.
The Quraysh tribe had a settlement near Latakia in Syria. It was at the end of the Silk Road, and it was in the vicinity of some Nazarene village. We also have textual evidence of Nazarene living in Transjordania.
That's where Jordan is today.
That's today it's called Jordania. Maybe you know the city of Petra.
Yeah. Okay. So it's Jordan, Petra.
Jordan. Transjordania means at the east of the Jordan River. You see in the writings of the authors of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, we are told about Jews, Christian Jews, Jews that belong to the Christian community of Jerusalem, that fled Jerusalem before the Romans siege, and some of them did not come back. And we are told of their settlements. Some of them were on the Golan Plateau, some of them were east of the Jordan River, and some of them in Syria. Okay. And so we can conjecture that some of them were living in Jordan.
What is today Jordan, and what is would be in the Nabatean area or Petra? Now, how would you define Nazarene?
There are two definitions for Nazarenes. One definition that you could make out of the sources from antiquity, from Augustine, Jerome, and from Eusebius. They are talking about Nazarenes, but we don't really know what they are. They are of Jewish. There is a Jewish origin. We don't really know what they are. One thing we can know for sure is what are the Quranic Nazarenes, because there we have a text, the Quran, which defines the Nazarenes, and we can look into it and define what the Quranic Nazarenes are. And those Quranic Nazarenes, so I'm not speaking about the Nazarene from the 3rd century or the 4th century. I'm talking here about the Quranic Nazarenes. Those Quranic Nazarenes are Jewish, but they believe that Jesus is the Messiah for Israel. They also don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Hence, they oppose both the rabbinical Jews and the Christians. And they form a kind of middle community between the rabbinical Jews who refuse Jesus and the Christian who put too much into Jesus.
Okay.
And this comes from the Quran. From the Quran only, we can have the definition of the Quranic Nazarenes.
Well, listen, you've given us an awful lot to chew on. This is a good introduction. Odon, I wanted to bring you on just to give an overview of what your thesis is. What would you name your thesis? How would you say? Would you call it Islam originated from a Nazarene source, Arab Nazarene source?
I think the Nazarene conquered, and they had a very strong influence at the origins of Islam. But the big picture is Islam is a millenarism that failed. The proto-Muslim...
what's the word you use there? Islam is a what ism? Millenarism?
A millenarism, a messianic movement that waited for the Messiah to come back, but it failed. They wanted Jesus to come back during the 630s when they took Jerusalem and they rebuilt the temple there, but Jesus did not come back. And so the millenarism expectations failed. And new millenarist expectations were formed by the Arab leaders, and they led to the formation of Islam. So Islam, as a short story, it is a failed apocalypse which led the Arab leaders to assume Jesus' power instead of Jesus because Jesus did not come back. And little by little, the Arab leaders became the caliphs, the most potent men on earth. They founded the caliphate, which is God's kings, and they founded Islam to justify their power without having to make a connection with their real past, their actual past. When the Abbasid took power, when they created the prophet character, the divine revelation, and so on, they disconnected the source of their power from the messianic expectation of the 7th century and from the Jewish and Christian beliefs of the 7th century. And they created a new kind of power, a new messianic power which owes nothing to Jesus, to the Messiah who did not come back, which owes nothing to the Jewish and Christian beliefs. So okay. This is my synthesis.
This is a good introduction, Odon. You've done us a real favor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What we're going to continue on with some more episodes, but I think for those of us who are being introduced to you for the first time, what I'm hearing you say, let me just do a quick overview and jump in if I've got you wrong. you have been working. How many years have you been working on this material?
Since 2009.
2009. So you're talking
2009, but I first read the Quran in 2007.
Okay, so 12 to 14 years you've been working on this material. That's a lot of years. Well done. And you have been really influenced by a Belgian priest, a French-speaking priest who is known as Edouard Marie Galez, who is in his 90s now, is very old, and he wrote the book The Messiah and His Prophet, which we need to get into English so we can read it and also be benefited by it. But you have written your book called The Greatest Secret of Islam. This is the book that kind of unpacks some of what you've been saying today. And
exactly.
So what we need to do is get that book. It is in English, am I correct?
It is. It will be in English
in the end of the summer. It will be in English.
End of the summer. But I've already made some presentation in English. And so if you go to the website, thegreatsecretofislam.com, you will find articles.
Right at the bottom here again.
Yes. And you will find also Arabic and Persian translations of my book.
Okay. You have taken Galez's thesis, and his thesis is the idea that Islam, if you want to go to the origins of Islam, you can use the artifacts that will help you, but that will only take you so far. You really need to go and look at the Quran itself. The Quran, which is made up of many layers, as you say, of different amalgamation of different texts, of different readings, of different instructions of how to read it. It looks like it is a composite of a lot of different, these Nazarene, Arab Nazarenes, who are the ones who have this view of Christ coming again. They're not Christians, they're not Jews, they're somewhere in between, and they believe that Christ was going to come again in the 630s, which did not happen. But it is these texts that you're saying that will help unpack how Islam began. If we look at the text anew, which you're going to be doing, and if we unpack it anew, which you're going to be doing, then we can see how Islam evolved. It didn't come overnight, but it was a book that certainly was what then Islam then used as what you might say, its basis, its foundation for everything that was to follow. And you're going to show us, you're going to say that you're not really interested in finding Muhammad per se, because there were many Muhammads. You're not interested in trying to even find what he did to create the Muhammad we have today. Your interest is what and how did Islam begin? What is Islam? How did it begin? Where did it begin? What were its influences? And by doing that,
you're going to question. Once you know how Islam began, the Muhammad question is solved.
It's solved. You're right, because you believe that he is a later creation, anyways. I assume you mean that he was used by the Abbasids or even by the Umayyads to begin with, but then enlarged by the Abbasids to have that prophetic mantle. They needed a prophet like the Jews and the Christians. They needed a mantle that they could say was their prophet who received this book, and therefore that's why he had to be created. And probably came about sometimes in the 730s, 740s, in the 8th century that started to begin. The Abbasids just perfected it as they then created their narrative. Well, this is going to be fun. And we're going to hear much more about these Nazarene people. We're going to hear an awful lot more about how you interpret the Quran. I thought it was fascinating how you even believe that there were diacritical marks, but that much of the Quran we have today are nothing more than a shorthand, quick way of writing it down. The diacritical marks, which then were introduced in the 8th century, created this problem, the whole problem with the qira'ats. And you've been following that discussion. That then became a huge difficulty because they should have done this from the very beginning, but they didn't. Shame on them. Listen, Odon, we're going to have you back again. And what is going to be the next thing we're going to talk about? Just so get people's appetite up. What are you going to talk about next?
I think we need to talk about the Quranic Nazarenes.
Okay, let's take that as the next one.
We will take a deep dive into the Quran.
You're using Yasser Qadhi's material now.
Exactly. And see who they are. And from this point, we will see what they taught the believers, what was their project. This is all in the Quran.
These millenarists, these people who were looking for the coming of Jesus in their lifetime, they are the ones that we need to look at next. So you're going to introduce who these Arab-speaking Nazarenes are. What was their ethos?
Arab-speaking Nazarenes, yes. Who they were.
Who they were, and what was their agenda, and how can we, by looking at them, understand how Islam began. Terrific. God bless you. This has been great having you, Odon. I've been waiting to meet you. It's so nice to finally come face to face. You might screen to screen. Listen, for those of you who don't know Odon, you're going to be seeing a lot more of him. He's going to bring his ideas. What we need you people to do now is to listen to what he's saying and comment. Odon has promised that he will look at the comments. He will try to respond to the comments. As we see good questions, I'll bring Odon back to answer some of those questions. So feel free to ask, but we're not going to be talking and we're not going to be looking at any trolling. We just want to have good comments with people that are engaging with his material, engaging with him, so that we can have good responses. We'll bring Odon back to do just that. It's been great having you, Odon. Thanks for this time. This is Odon.
Thank you, Jay.
And Jay, 3,000 miles apart. Over and out.